Good morning, everybody. Well, as I was explaining to my second year students the other day, if you're wondering, if you're watching this in the second semester, you're wondering, why is this guy wearing, short sleeves? Well, it's still January back here. If I make a video and everything in it's still valid in the second semester, then, I'm not going to re-record it. But if something changes, then you'll suddenly see me in winter woolies. Right. Let's start with study unit 1. And the name of this study unit is Introduction. And it deals with methodology. People may be tempted to skip this. Please don't. This is very important because we're going to describe different ways of looking at religion. And some of the chapters that follow will follow one way, and the other chapters will follow the other way. So if you skip this, then you won't know what we're talking about. Right. So we start with defining religion. And we give you two. Definition 1, a working religion. Right? And so it's a functional religion. It says, this is what religion does. This is how it functions in society. Okay, that's one way to define religion. There are others. And if you scroll down a bit, you see definition 2, which is much longer. Right? Then you see the two types of definition below that. Reductionist. Another word for that is functional, and essentialist. And in our department, we tend to go with the functional definitions. So for our current purposes, make sure that you know the functional definition, definition 1. Or reductionist. I don't like the word reductionist, but we decided on that when we wrote this material, so okay, we're stuck with it. I prefer functional. Right, let's see. The problem with an essentialist definition is that, frankly, it comes too close to theology, Unless you are really good, which Rudolf Otto made up definition 2. He was good, subtle thinker. But if you're not as good as Rudolf Otto, then your definition becomes a theological one rather than a scholarly scholar of religion type of definition. Okay, so these things are not cast in stone. For our purposes in this module, we give you 2 examples, and we say that we tend to work with the first one. Make sure that you know it. Now, that's always going to be an exam question. Potentially. But if I wanted to, I could list 100. Give me Google and an hour or so, I could list 100 definitions of religion that have been put forward easily. So in religious studies, the definition of religion is something we keep coming back to again and again and again. And when you're a postgraduate student, it's considered more sporting to make up your own definition of religion. 1.2, how do we study religion? Very important. Distinguish between phenomenological and critical approaches. Right. First, we talk about positivistic approaches, which are common in things like sociology of religion and other. This is where you crunch the numbers, right? And in religious studies, we are not a numbers-oriented discipline. Now, perhaps we should be. Perhaps we should take numbers more seriously. See, but that is not our tradition. Our tradition is to work with what people are saying, doing, feeling, thinking. And so there are two areas in this. The first one is the phenomenological approach. That is very easy to mispronounce and misspell, but I've seen some really interesting spellings in exams. Don't worry about it. You need to know phenomenology. And basically, if I go to research a new religious phenomenon, a church that's just been started. Somebody has founded a church, I go, hey, I'm going to see what these guys do. Whatever these guys say they believe, I take it as such, right? If they say we believe that the world is a flat disk on the back of a turtle, which stands on the back of an elephant, then that's what I report. I don't judge it. I don't say these guys are obviously wrong. No, I say this is what I have found. This is what they tell me they believe. And you can then observe them in actual worship and say, and either yes, they worship according to these official beliefs, or they worship a little differently. There's a bit of a disconnection here. You can do that. It's still phenomenology. But I don't bring, as far as possible, my own views into it. I report what they tell me. That's phenomenology. Right? And the other, there's a recommended activity that you listen to this podcast, and it's really worth it. It'll take you half an hour, and by then you really understand what phenomenology is about, because James Cox is at the moment a flag bearer of this approach. Then there are critical approaches. Excuse me. Critical approaches, there's not one, there are many. It started more or less with Marxism. And whatever you think of Marxism, communism, Karl Marx, following on the philosopher Feuerbach, made some really telling criticisms of religion. He showed that religion in the time and place where he lived, 19th century Prussian Empire, was being used to maintain power relations. In other words, the aristocrats who ran the place were using religion to suppress the peasants. Now, putting it a little bit crudely, but and look, you can't deny that he was right. That is what was happening at the time, at that place. Now, from there, different critical approaches have developed. Sigmund Freud is mentioned, and a Freudian approach to religion still exists and is still being done. Feminists have shown how religion is working to maintain power relations between men and women in the men's favor. And then there are post-colonial approaches, which show how during the colonial era and still today, there was a way that religion was being studied and being propagated in a way that maintained the power of the colonizer and reduced the power of the colonized. So there's a link between post-colonial and Marxist critiques. It's not a direct link, but you can see the same thing going on there. In Marxism, you're talking about power relations inside a single society. In post-colonial, you're talking about power relations between societies as well. Right? And there are human rights criticisms of religion. So what those guys would say is, if, for example, the Catholic Church forbids contraception, then there are hordes of children around, and that leads to poverty. Right? What are we going to do about that? That's just an example. I'm not picking on the Catholics here. Okay, so we're going over this very quickly. Right, there's a few concepts in this feedback there: modernity and secularization. Make sure that you read a bit about secularization, because you're going to see it again in the very last module when we talk about atheism and unbelief. Alright, why study religion today? There's a bit of an activity there. Well, I suppose you know why you're enrolled for this module. Some of you, well, for some of you it's compulsory. You have my sympathies, and others did enrolled for this course because they find it interesting. And I hope that those of you who are taking it because you have to will end up also finding it interesting in its own right. Major phases in the history of religion. Right? So now we're looking at religion historically as it developed. Important there in the second paragraph, don't think that a later form of religion is better than an earlier one. We tend to think on the analogy of, for example, scientific development, that Einstein was more right than Newton, and Newton was more right than the guys in the Middle Ages, and that is, religion is the same. And that is just wrong. A religion lives in a context, in a certain period, at a certain place. And it develops for that context. It's more like evolution than scientific development. See, you can't say that an elephant is more developed than a dinosaur. Dinosaurs were the dominant creatures in their time. They're not around anymore. Times changed. So, for example, you can't say that Islam today is superior to Islam in the 10th century. It doesn't work that way. Islam in the 10th century, in wherever, say Egypt, was the right thing for Egypt in the 10th century. Islam in South Africa today is the right kind of Islam for South Africa today. And so with all the other religions. So don't, when we say that religion developed over time, that doesn't mean they got better. It doesn't mean that necessarily they got worse either. You can argue that either way. But this is not a climb towards perfection. And in fact, in religion itself, in all the major religions, there's a strong current that says religion was at its best when the founders were around. Well, think about it. That you're, say, a Christian. You were in Palestine in the first half of the first century. You didn't have to wonder what Jesus would have thought of something. You could go up and ask him. Right? So when was Christianity at its peak? There's an argument that say at the beginning, and that it's been downhill ever since. You find that in Hinduism, you find it in Buddhism. I'm not entirely sure what Islam and Judaism would say about it. But so, you see, so it's not that things are getting better necessarily. There's even an argument that it's getting worse. Okay, so we just go through this, the Old Stone Age, where we don't really know. A few years ago, I wrote an article on the books of Jean M. Auel. She wrote this book, The Clan of the Cave Bear. Made a movie out of it, and there's 5 or 6 books in that series. And I wrote a book on religion in those books, wrote an article about religion in those series of books, in which I said, but we know so little. Yes, there are figurines, and we call them goddesses because we don't know what else to call them. Hey, there could have been Old Stone Age porn for all we know. We don't really know. Right. As we go into the New Stone Age, the Neolithic, things start becoming a little much clearer, but there's still nothing's being written down. Then there's the time of the first cities. Right? This is when writing was invented, and now we're starting to get onto firmer ground. We're starting to see, hey, this is what's happening. Right? And then comes the Axial Age. Axial means of an axle. It is the axle on which history turns. Now, those 1,000 years or so are so absolutely important to history, especially to religious history, because this is when Judaism found the shape that largely we can still see today. There was something before that, but then we can see, okay, that is Judaism. This is when Christianity started. This is when Hinduism started. This is when Buddhism started. Islam comes right at the end of that period. Confucianism in China, Taoism in China, all the major religious patterns that are still with us today were laid down in those 1,000 years. It is the axis or axle of history. And that term, Axial Age, was invented by a philosopher called Karl Jaspers, by the way. Right. So, the medieval period and the modern age, please make sure that you know what happened in those periods. And then we have a few words on postmodernism, the postmodern age. Alright, so that is the timeline of religious development. And as we start looking at individual religions later on, see if you can fit them in there. Where do they fit? Mainly. See, because no religion has stayed where it started. Right? So you say, right, Christianity is a religion from the Axial Age. But it has developed since. It has, there have been theologians, there have been people thinking about Christianity ever since. So even if we can say the main patterns were laid down in the Axial Age, there have been further developments in the medieval and the modern age. Families of religions. Now, some of you are not going to like this, because you've been brought up to think that your religion is, not just the only true one, but it is unique. There's nothing else like it. However, when we look at it from a scholarly perspective, and we see how the one came out of the other and how they developed alongside each other, then yes, there are patterns, historical patterns, but also thematic patterns. Right, so Asian religions and Abrahamic religions are two major groups. Now, if you look at Hinduism and Buddhism, you can see the similarities. Right? Buddhism did not come out of Hinduism. They both came out of an earlier form of Hinduism. We call it Brahmanism or Vedism, that earlier form. Right? And so, what I like to say is that Hinduism is the form of Indian religion that stayed in India and is absolutely right for India. And Buddhism is the export version. In Buddhism, they sliced off everything that would be difficult to understand if you were not totally immersed in the Indian environment, and they exported it to the rest of Asia. We'll get back to that. Right? In China, there's another group of Asian religions, Confucianism and Taoism. Taoism is sometimes written with a T, same thing. Now, in this course, we are not going to talk about Chinese religions very much. We'd love to, but, this course is getting too big already. Then, Abrahamic religions include Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Those are the three big ones. There are others, and we will meet them. The newest member of this group is the Baha'i faith, which we will meet in the very last module. And there are other more obscure groups like the Mandaeans, the Chaldeans. They're under threat now in the Middle East, but they've survived there for a long time. Zoroastrianism was probably the first of this group to really become an institutionalized religion. Very little of it left, only the Parsi community in India these days. See, but what do they have in common? They have in common the belief in a single God, which at the time they started it was a crazy idea. Everybody around them said there are many gods. But the guys who started this group of religions said, nope, there's one God. That's it. Right. Okay, you can see there's a bit of further explanation of it. Right, and then a page or two later, some important dangers associated with classifying religions. Families or religion should not be considered as pure separate systems. right? What that means is that they've all been in touch with each other, they've all influenced each other, they've all picked out ideas from their neighbors and said, I think we can use this. You know, the classical example of this is Sikhism, which is a religion in India that quite consciously combines Hindu and Muslim and a few other elements to form over the last 500 years a new separate religion. We call that a syncretic religion, but if you take the long view, all religions are syncretic. Let's take Christianity for an example. Christianity spent most of the Middle Ages trying to figure out how they could reconcile the material in the Bible with Greek philosophy. And people spend their lives trying to figure out how they could bring these two together. Eventually this was done by a guy called Thomas Aquinas, and then it was torn apart again by another guy called Martin Luther. But Christianity as we know it today would have been quite strange to the Christians of the 1st and 2nd centuries, because how are we now supposed to understand this 21st century Christianity when you've adopted these Greek ideas, these philosophical ideas? I mean, in the 1st and 2nd century, Christianity was about rejecting those ideas in favor of something new, different. Okay, so when we talk about families of religion, we're looking at very broad patterns, and we're temporarily ignoring all these interchanges between religions. Right? Secondly, classifications of families of religion can prevent one from seeing their consequent spread and specifically local manifestations. So, just because Christianity belongs to the Abrahamic religions, that shouldn't stop you from saying that African initiated churches are a new, vibrant, rather exciting way in which people look at Christianity, or which they express their Christianity. Right, the third problem is that it marginalizes indigenous traditions. Now, where most of these two module students live, that means African traditional religion. Right? African traditional religion can't be placed under these vast families of religion, and therefore, we don't need to study it. Well, that's wrong. African traditional religion, is alive and well in South Africa. They may not have buildings, and they may not show up on TV programs, but a very large part of the South African society, will go to their church on Sunday, but on Monday, if they're not feeling well, they will go to the Sangoma and find out what they've done to displease the ancestors. And so we must also just be very critical of this idea that you can only belong to one religion. That is a legacy of the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam mostly. Because they brought out the idea, not only is there just one God, but there's only one true religion. And in the rest of the world, that is considered a very strange idea. In Japan, they take censuses and ask people, what religion do you belong to? And when you add them all up, it adds up to 150% of the Japanese population, because very many Japanese put in more than one religion. Yeah. In Japan, you are born and you are introduced to the world and the community in a Shinto ceremony. Shinto is the ancient native Japanese tradition. You grow up and you get married in a Christian church, because the Christians throw the best weddings. And then you go old, you die, and you are buried as a Buddhist, because the Buddhist gives the best chance for a good afterlife. Nobody in Japan thinks that is strange. You can belong to more than one religion there. Okay? So, same thing is happening here in South Africa. People are good Christians and good African traditionalists. So that is the problem with these classifications. There are too many religions that just fall through the net, that don't get classified. And therefore they don't get researched, they don't get talked about. Right? And we need to be careful. When we talk about religion, we talk about all kinds of religion, not just the ones that we like. Right. Then we talk a bit about the structure of this module. Read it. Right. And okay, that's it for today. I've spoken too long already. Yo, half an hour. I must learn to move faster.